A vast wetland in eastern China, flat, silent. The reeds have thinned to almost nothing. The soil is cracked and pale. In 1985, Chinese scientists walked through this reserve and write something devastating in their report. The park is ecologically dead. No large herbivores. No grazing pressure to shape the land. Forests are collapsing inward. The wetlands shrinking, the entire system quietly unraveling with nothing to hold it together. So the government makes a decision that most scientists think is borderline reckless. They take 39 Père David's deer, a species already extinct in the wild, the last of their kind anywhere on Earth, and release them into this emptiness. 39 animals, one dead park. The odds are almost insulting. The scientists who opposed the plan weren't being pessimistic. They were being rational. These deer had never lived in the wild, not one of them, not their parents, not their grandparents. And yet here they are, standing in the grass of Dafeng Reserve, blinking into a landscape their species hasn't touched in nearly a century. 40 years later, that park is unrecognizable, and what the deer did to it, that part nobody saw coming. The Père David's deer should not exist. That is not an exaggeration. By the early 1900s, the species was completely gone from the wild in China. Its native range reduced to 0. The only reason it survived at all was a single captive herd kept inside Beijing's imperial hunting garden, hidden behind walls, unknown to the outside world for centuries. Then 1900 arrived. Floods breached the garden. What followed? The Beijing herd was destroyed almost entirely. A handful of individuals had been sent to European estates years earlier, most critically to Woburn Abbey in England. And that accident of timing is the only reason the species still breathes today. By the 1980s, every Père David's deer alive on Earth lived in a zoo or on a private estate. Not one wild individual existed anywhere. The entire species balanced on the edge of a captive population scattered across foreign countries. Returning them to China wasn't just conservation, it was something closer to resurrection. Picture a coastline stripped of everything that once made it alive. No large animals moving through the grass. No grazing pressure shaping the vegetation. Just flat, marshy terrain stretching toward the Yellow Sea. Reed beds growing dense and tangled, sedge marshes accumulating in the wrong directions, an ecosystem frozen mid-collapse. That was Dafeng Nature Reserve in Jiangsu Province by the early 1980s, a place that looked like wilderness from a distance, but functioned like an empty room. Dafeng sits along China's eastern coast, where the land flattens into tidal wetlands and the Yellow Sea pushes salt air deep into the reed marshes. For thousands of years, this kind of terrain was exactly where Père David's deer thrived. Flat ground, shallow water, soft vegetation. The species evolved for this. Their splayed hooves were built for boggy soil. Their grazing patterns were calibrated to the exact type of plant communities that grow where fresh water meets coastal marsh. Dafeng wasn't chosen at random. It was chosen because the land remembered what the deer were. But decades of human activity had hollowed it out. Hunting pressure through the 19th and early 20th centuries had eliminated large mammals from the region entirely. Agricultural land conversion had eaten into the buffer zones around the wetlands. By the time Chinese conservationists began seriously evaluating the site, Dafeng covered approximately 78,000 acres of protected coastal habitat. But that protection existed mostly on paper. Ecological machinery had stopped running. Without large grazers, reed beds spread unchecked across areas that should have been open water meadow. Without grazing animals cropping vegetation at the margins, sediment dynamics shifted. The marsh was overgrown and underperforming. There were no apex predators left, no wolves, no large cats working the perimeter, no mid-sized grazers keeping plant growth in check. The food web had been reduced to its lower rungs. Insects, birds, small mammals, all of them operating in an ecosystem that had lost its structural engineers. A wetland without large herbivores is like a factory floor with all the machinery removed. The building is still there, the processes have stopped. Chinese authorities designated Dafeng as a national nature reserve in 1973, but the decision to specifically engineer it as a reintroduction site came later, driven by the recognition that passive protection wasn't enough. Protecting empty land doesn't restore what's missing. The government understood that bringing the deer back required a site that could plausibly sustain them, and that Dafeng, despite its degraded state, had the bones of a functional habitat. The coastal wetland geography matched the species' historical range. The flat terrain reduced predation risk during a vulnerable re-establishment phase. The reed marshes, overgrown as they were, represented a food source that could support a founding population while the ecosystem recalibrated. What Dafeng offered wasn't perfection, it offered possibility. A site ecologically physiologically hollow enough to need the deer and historically appropriate enough to receive them. The experiment needed a stage. Dafeng was it. Crates, veterinary monitors, international paperwork crossing time zones. In 1985, 40 years of absence began to end, not with ceremony, but with the careful, anxious business of moving living animals across the world without losing them. The agreement between China and Woburn Abbey in the United Kingdom formalized what conservationists on both sides had been working toward for years. Woburn Abbey, the private estate of the Duke of Bedford, had been the unlikely refuge that saved the species from total extinction in the early 20th century. The 11th Duke had gathered the last surviving individuals from European zoos around 1900, when the wild population in China was already gone. By 1985, the global captive population had grown, but it remained small, fragile, and genetically compressed from decades of breeding within a limited founding group. Woburn agreed to transfer 39 deer to Dafeng. That number wasn't arbitrary. It represented a calculated balance between what the reserve could initially support and what the genetic pool could afford to send. The deer had been absent from Chinese soil for more than 80 years. The individuals making the journey in 1985 were generations removed from any ancestor that had ever lived wild. They had known only managed parkland, hand-feeding schedules, and the rhythms of captive life. Returning them to China wasn't simply a transport operation. It was an attempt to reintroduce a behavioral inheritance that had been interrupted for nearly a century. Genetic diversity was the central technical concern, with a species that had passed through such a severe population bottleneck. At one point, the entire global population may have numbered fewer than 20 individuals. Every breeding decision carried outsized consequences. The 39 animals selected for transfer were chosen to maximize the genetic variation available within the captive population. Age ratios, sex ratios, lineage records, all of it was cross-referenced to give the founding group at Dafeng the broadest possible genetic foundation. A narrow gene pool in a reintroduction program is a slow-motion extinction. The selection process was designed to prevent exactly that. Transport required climate-controlled shipping conditions, continuous veterinary monitoring, and coordination between Chinese wildlife authorities, British estate managers, and international conservation bodies. The animals were moved under protocols that accounted for stress responses, immune vulnerability during transit, and the physiological shock of climate adjustment. Northern Jiangsu in summer is humid and warm, a different world from the temperate English parkland the deer had known. When the 39 animals arrived at Dafeng in 1985, Chinese state media covered the moment as a national conservation milestone. Officials marked it as the return of a lost species to its ancestral homeland. The language was celebratory, and the symbolism was real. But 39 deer and 78,000 acres of degraded coastal wetland, carrying the genetic legacy of a near-extinction event, no experience of wild conditions. The milestone was only the beginning of the problem. Think of it like transplanting a tree that has only ever grown in a greenhouse. The roots exist, the biology is intact, but the soil is different, the wind is different, and the first hard frost could end everything. That was the reality at Dafeng in 1986. The 39 Père David's deer that arrived from the United Kingdom were not simply released into the open reserve. Scientists knew better than that. The animals were placed into large semi-wild enclosures, holding areas within the reserve that allowed the deer to begin adjusting to Chinese coastal conditions without the full pressure of an uncontrolled environment. It was a staged transition designed to reduce shock and give researchers a chance to intervene if things went wrong fast. And things did go wrong. The coastal wetlands of Jiangsu Province bear almost no resemblance to the manicured grounds of Woburn Abbey. The vegetation was unfamiliar, the climate swings were severe. Summers brought suffocating humidity. Winters brought temperatures that dropped hard and fast across the flat, exposed landscape. In the first years of monitoring, the Dafeng research team recorded every single birth and every single death, tracking the herd's trajectory with the kind of obsessive documentation that comes from knowing there is no margin for error. The global captive population at the time numbered fewer than 2,000 animals. Losing the Chinese cohort was not an abstract risk. Disease was a constant threat. Animals that had been bred in European parks for generations carried immune profiles shaped by European pathogens. Exposure to local bacteria, parasites, and environmental stressors created vulnerabilities that the team could not fully anticipate in advance. Veterinary staff conducted regular health assessments, and mortality in the early period was real. The population did not surge. It teetered. Flooding compounded everything. The Yellow Sea coastal plain is one of the most flood-prone landscapes in eastern China, and Dafeng sits directly in its path. In multiple early seasons, rising water levels inundated grazing areas, stressed the animals, and disrupted feeding patterns at exactly the moments when the herd could least afford disruption. Researchers documented these events in detail, building a record of resilience and of loss that would later become foundational to every subsequent rewilding effort in the region. Then came the moment that changed the scientific calculus entirely. The first successful breeding season on Chinese soil produced viable fawns that survived past their critical early weeks. It sounds simple. It was not. It meant the deer could reproduce under local conditions. It meant the genetics were holding. It meant the experiment had cleared the single most important biological threshold it needed to clear. The population still had years of fragility ahead, but the direction had changed. Picture a stone dropped into still water. The ripple doesn't ask permission, it just moves outward, touching everything in its path whether the surrounding water is ready or not. That is what happened at Dafeng once the Père David's deer population stabilized and began moving through the reserve in earnest. These are not small, delicate animals. Adult males can exceed 200 kilograms. They graze heavily, they move in groups, and they have a distinctive behavior called wallowing, submerging themselves in shallow mud and water that physically reshapes the ground beneath them. Individually, each behavior is unremarkable. Collectively, across a growing herd in a wetland ecosystem, they became a restructuring force. The mechanism works like this. Heavy grazing cuts through dense reed beds that had grown unchecked for decades across the reserve. Where the reeds thin out, light reaches the ground. New plant species establish. The habitat shifts from a monoculture of tall grass to a mosaic of open patches, shallow margins, and varied vegetation layers. That mosaic is not just prettier, it is functionally richer, supporting far more species than the uniform reed cover it replaced. Wallowing accelerated the process. As the herd grew through the 1990s and into the 2000s, wallow sites multiplied across the reserve. Each one created a shallow depression that held water. Those depressions became breeding pools for amphibians and aquatic invertebrates. Water birds that require open, shallow water for foraging began appearing at sites where they had no reason to visit before. The deer had not been managed to create these pools. They created them anyway, because that is what Père David's deer do. Below the surface, the transformation continued. Dung distributed across thousands of acres fed soil microbes and insects at a scale the degraded reserve had not experienced in living memory. Carcasses, inevitable in any wild population, fed scavengers and restarted nutrient pathways that had been effectively dead since the wetland collapsed. The food web, threadbare for decades, began to thicken from the bottom up. Within roughly 10 years of the herd reaching meaningful population density, species that had no recorded presence in the Dafeng Reserve began returning without any human assistance. They came because the habitat had become livable again. The deer had not been managed to attract them. The deer had simply done what large herbivores do in functioning ecosystems. And the ecosystem had responded. 39 animals had quietly begun rewriting the ecological history of 78,000 acres. Think of it like compound interest. You put in something small, something almost negligible, and for years it barely seems to matter. Then one day you look at the account and the number is unrecognizable. That is exactly what happened at Dafeng. In 1985, 39 deer stepped off transport vehicles onto Chinese soil for the first time in over a century. 39. That was the entire investment, the entire bet. And for a while, the returns were agonizingly slow. Survival was not guaranteed, breeding was uncertain, and the margin between success and extinction remained razor thin for years, but the numbers did not stay small. By the mid-1990s, the herd at Dafeng had crossed 100 individuals. By 2000, it had surpassed 300. The reserve itself had to be physically expanded to keep pace with the growing population. What began as a contained wetland enclosure stretched outward, eventually encompassing tens of thousands of additional acres to accommodate a herd that refused to stop growing. By the 2020s, Dafeng alone hosts several thousand Père David's deer. Across all reintroduction sites in China combined, the total population has exceeded 7,000 individuals. A species that had 0 members on Chinese soil in 1984 now represents one of the most successful large mammal recoveries in Asian conservation history. The deer multiplied, and everything around them multiplied with them. In the 1980s, wildlife surveys at Dafeng recorded a thin, impoverished community of species. the kind of ecological ledger you expect from decades of agricultural pressure and habitat degradation. By the 2020s, that same reserve documented over 400 species of wildlife. 400 birds that had not been recorded in the region for generations, fish species returning to waterways that had been functionally dead, plant communities reassembling themselves into configurations that ecologists had only seen in historical records. None of this was directly managed. No one released the birds, no one restocked the fish, the habitat recovered, and the species followed the habitat. The international scientific community noticed. In 2019, Dafeng Milu National Nature Reserve was designated a UNESCO World Natural Heritage Site, one of the most rigorous environmental designations on the planet, awarded only when an area demonstrates outstanding universal value to the natural world. The reserve that had once been a degraded coastal flat, chosen partly because no one else wanted it, now carries the same designation as the Serengeti and the Galapagos. 39 animals became 7,000, a barren reserve became a UNESCO site, and a species that existed only in foreign zoos is now undeniably home. There is a version of this story that ends with the deer and the birds and the biodiversity numbers, and that version is extraordinary on its own, but the version that matters most to the future ends somewhere else entirely. When the buffer zones around Dafeng were established, local farmers and fishermen lost access to land and water they had worked for generations. The friction was real, the resentment was real. Conservation that ignores that reality does not last. What replaced it was something unexpected. Ecotourism turned Dafeng into one of eastern China's most visited wildlife destinations. The Père David's deer stopped being an ecological project and became a cultural identity, printed on signage, built into school curricula, anchoring museums and conservation education centers that draw visitors from across the country. A deer that had no name in China for a century now has its face on the regional economy. The lesson that governments and conservation organizations now travel to study is not just about deer, it is about proof. Proof that rewilding does not have to hollow out the communities surrounding it. Proof that wildlife recovery and rural livelihoods can grow in the same direction. 39 animals rewrote an ecosystem. The ecosystem rewrote the economy, and the economy is still changing. Dafeng's surplus deer seeded reserves across China. Shishu, along the Yangtze, received its own herd. In 1993, a flood released them into the wild. They survived. That population is now self-sustaining. No single disaster can erase them anymore. Subscribe for more stories like this one.